So welcome everybody to the final webinar of our week-long Voices of Experience season. Thanks everybody who's joined us this week, and thank you to everyone who's made it a really interesting experience. We ran the first series of Voices of Experience last November. It was a bit of a light touch, but what we discovered then is that it was a really good experience, because a lot of people were saying we want to see more of this. They suggested some additional topics that we had this week, and also people wanted to, we were asked for them to be recorded, which we didn't do last time. So it's been a very positive experience this week, despite what my eyes might say. We're delivering sort of, quite a lot of webinars this week, but it's been really good. So we're going to be going into the effective disclosure webinar this morning. Should take an hour to an hour and a half, I think. Like with all of our webinars, if you want to pop stuff in the chat as we go along, we'll try and answer those sort of questions as we proceed. But I think we've got, how many have we got? We've got 17 in the meeting this morning. We might get a couple of extras. If we have tons and tons of comments, sometimes it's hard to keep track. But then what we will do is we shall make sure that we have like a good Q&A at the end, and then if you want to pop your question in the chat there, fine, or if you want to just pop your hand up and say and ask your question, then that's good as well. We don't really mind that, that's all right. Okay, let me just get the internet jiggery pokery all sorted, and then I think we are good to go. I'm going to be sort of talking about a few things here, and my colleague Chris is going to be jumping in as and when, so you'll hear my voice and you'll hear his voice, so that should be good. Right, we shall get going then. Okay, let's hopefully let's have a look. I just realised I just haven't put the audio on there, because we need to have some audio. We've got some video coming up in a moment, so I need to ensure that I do the computer sound so you'll be able to hear the video in a bit. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Give me a little thumbs up if you can see that, that would be good. Brilliant. Okay, let's get going. Okay, effective disclosure. So this is there are some similarities, I think, with a couple of the other webinars that we have also delivered. So when we do ones on we have a full 2-hour webinar on supporting adults with a previous conviction, and the disclosure is always a key aspect of that particular webinar and that particular training course. We delivered it earlier on this week for Merthyr Tydfil Council, and they found that particular section useful. So it's got elements of that, and it goes into sort of not quite, I wouldn't quite call it a deep dive into that subject, but it certainly does tackle that in a little bit more depth. And effective disclosure is one of the sort of cornerstones of anyone really who's looking to get into employment, or maybe is looking to go into education. Myself and Chris have both got experience of supporting individuals on that particular route. So this is what we're going to be talking about today really. The overview is I'm going to be looking at the job application framework as it applies to employment. So we're going to be looking at things like disclosure in the application and disclosure in the interview, and the best way to do that. I'm going to give you a disclosure framework, which I've called WADL, W-A-D-L. Don't worry, I'll be talking about that. And then after that, I'm going to talk about change and how you can show that change has occurred, and that kind of personal growth, and those sort of like 4 R's there that we've got, which I'm going to come on to in a bit. So don't worry if you don't know what they are just yet. I will be telling you, so that's all right. I'm also going to be giving us some interview tips, and then at the end we've got a Q&A. So that should be all right, I hope. Okay, let me just double check everything's good. That's good. Right. Okay. Let me proceed accordingly. So what I want to know is if you could please pop your stuff in the chat. I want to know why you're here today, what you want to get from this particular webinar. It's always important to put this on there. First of all, we know then that the chat is working, but also it's important then that we know that we're going to be talking about some of the things. Maybe people want us to focus on a specific thing, or maybe people want us to talk about something that maybe we hadn't considered before, or maybe people have got like a very specific query that's important that we address. So if you want to pop what you want us to get at, what you want us to focus on particularly, maybe we've already highlighted that we're going to be covering it. But if there's anything specifically, pop it in the chat and we'll see what we've got. The best way to inform an employer of a conviction. Yeah, we've got some stuff on that, Aaron. Understand the best way of disclosing criminal records where applicable. Yeah, definitely we've got some good stuff on that. And how to support participants at interview to deal with the disclosure discussion. Yeah, that we've definitely got some good stuff on that. So that's particularly good. I've got I think it's a very simple but straightforward way of disclosing, and some additional resources on there. Supporting prisoners pre-release with CV, disclosure and interview skills. We're not really going to be looking at the CV so much, Helen, because the CV really is all about where you sell the best version of yourself, and I often advise people not to put that on a CV. A CV is looked at on average by an employer for only 7 seconds, so you don't want to give them any reason why they shouldn't shortlist you. So disclosure shouldn't take place either on a CV or on a covering letter. It should really go on a disclosure statement. So I would advise you not to put disclosure on a CV, so I hope that's okay. But how to disclose, how to deal with it in an interview, we've got tons of stuff on that, so that should be alright. Okay, so let's go back to the slides. Here we go. Right, thank you very much for that. I always like to put that on there because sometimes webinars can be a little bit one way, so it's good for me to know that you're all still there. Okay, so in terms of the obligation to disclose a conviction, I put this little slide up there. You may have seen this slide up before if you came on our introduction to supporting adults with a criminal record. I use this slide there as well, and because people think that they have to disclose a conviction all the time. So I do a lot of freelance for different organisations. One of the charities I freelance for is a rugby charity, School of Hard Knocks. Every time I run a course, well, every time I'm supporting a course, we meet, at least half of the participants have got a conviction. Many of them think that if they've got a conviction, they just have to disclose it all the time. They've not really got a great understanding of working out when their spent dates are. So they just think they have to disclose it all the time. So, and that isn't always the case. So I'm gonna run through this little flow chart here. So you've got to think about the type of role that they are applying for. Is it covered by the ROA? Apologies for a bit of jargon then. That's the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act 1974. And basically what that act states is that some offences can be considered forgotten after a rehabilitation period if there has been no further reoffending or no further conviction. And that allows them to move on with their life and not to leave a lifelong blot on their record. And that lifelong blot on their record is, I'm paraphrasing there now, but that's basically what it says in the Act. So if it's covered by the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, that's most jobs. So if you're working in a shop, if you're, like I used to be a carpet fitter for a while, you've got sort of a regular sort of job. If you're doing any kind of job where you're not working with children or vulnerable adults, generally that role is covered by the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. So if it's covered, your employer has the right to ask you to do a basic DBS check, okay, a disclosure and barring service check, a DBS check. So if they do that check, and it's a basic check, that check will, when they do that check, if that check comes back and there is no information about any convictions on that form, that basically says that either there hasn't been a conviction or that any convictions are now spent. So So if it comes back clean, you know that all your convictions, if there are any, are all spent. However, it may state that there is an unspent conviction, in which case a basic DBS check would show that. On an application form or on the application process, however that employer is doing it, if there's not a question about criminal records, then you don't have to disclose. So if there's no question about convictions, you don't have to disclose. If there is a question about convictions, then an applicant should disclose any offences which are unspent. Okay, so if they've got convictions which are spent, they don't need to disclose those because they are spent, they've gone through the rehabilitation period. But if there are questions about a conviction and you have convictions which are unspent, then they should disclose. Okay? On the other side of the chart, these are roles which require a standard or enhanced DBS check, and I imagine that most of us on this webinar and that have been joining us this week, we all work in the field of sort of supporting people. We all work with people who are, have got previous convictions. We've all probably had to do an enhanced DBS check as part of our role. The reason for that is that our roles are generally seen as being exempt from the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. So we're not covered. So we might have to do a standard check. Standard are generally licensed professions, people like barristers, football stewards, members of the Master Locksmiths Guild, or enhanced checks are often done for people like teachers, healthcare workers, support workers, social workers, that kind of thing. Again, on that check, is there a question about convictions or criminal records? If there's not on the application form, the job application form, then you don't need to disclose. The reason why that might be there is because it may be thought that that having a previous conviction is not necessarily applicable to that role, and it's down to the employer to decide that. But if there is a question about convictions or criminal records, then yes, the individual should disclose. They should disclose because a standard or enhanced check will not only check barred lists, but it will also show previous convictions which are spent, because of course it goes into greater detail. So you should disclose any convictions or cautions which are not yet filtered by the DBS system. Filtering is basically a process where historical convictions which should no longer which are no longer deemed to be against the law are sometimes thrown up. If you're interested in that, drop me an email. I'll send you the links to all the relevant pages on the Unlock website. So that's a basic sort of process in terms of when you should disclose, when you don't need to disclose. So I'm going to stop sharing there. Chris, I know you're going to come in there, aren't you? And you're going to talk about your experiences. If I can hand over to you.
Hi, morning everyone. So in terms of the disclosure barring process, I'm a person with lived experience of the justice system, and I've gone through the whole the whole process from start to finish. From a person that's reintegrating back into society point of view, it's very scary when someone mentions DBS. Immediately it gets you back up. You automatically think the worst. The common misconception is that you're going to fail it. There's been tens of people that we support who have heard DBS and immediately thought, I'm not applying for that role because I'm going to fail. And it's only through trial and error where I found out there isn't a fail, and it is a case of just kind of, your DBS is your DBS. It's going to state your offences. It's going to be a piece of paper that you're not very proud of. However, in my kind of experience, I left prison, and during my open jail, I volunteered with a company. So they kind of already knew my background beforehand. However, when it came time to me applying for a paid employment, I then had to go through the DBS check, which I didn't have to go through previously when I was volunteering. So during that process, as far as I'm concerned, they knew all my background. I still went through the interview process, and I still had to discuss my offences. Now, it led to massive anxiety, and it was a very difficult conversation to have. However, I knew the people that were interviewing me, so it was more, I would say, embarrassment of me having to go through things again. And that's what you'll find with a lot of people, whether yourself are an ex-offender or you support people reintegrating back to society. It's more the anxiety of discussing your offence all over again. It could be 10 years. Mine was 3, 4 years, but there's people where it's, their offences are 10 years ago, and it kind of brings it back for them, and it puts them in an uncomfortable place. And I always try to kind of explain to people that it's always past tense. Your DBS or whatever convictions you have and whatever's on there, it's never current. It's always in the past, whether it be a year, whether it be 10 years, it's never kind of there. But kind of going back to my experience, I'd like to share a letter with you that I received. So I've sent off for my DBS. I'm literally just waiting for my DBS to come and for my start date. Sorry about this. Hang on, I'll just get it up for you. Please forgive me. Jamie's the technical genius in our organisation. I'm severely lacking. My deepest apologies. I'm running some. I can't share it for some reason, but I'll kind of talk you through the letter. I received a letter from the Disclosure and Barring Service saying that we, who we are, the DBS, the Disclosure and Barring Service, and we are writing to you following your application for an enhanced disclosure. We are writing to you. We have received information from a certain police force in regards to my conviction, and we are considering where to bar you from regulated work with vulnerable adults. Now, I work in support, and I was a student at the time, and I work in support. So this letter really knocked me for six, and I didn't understand it. I couldn't understand why I was sent it. I'd gone to probation. They'd never seen it. I'd gone to, or anyone I kind of knew I'd asked, they hadn't seen it. So you can imagine I was absolutely petrified for weeks. And then I knew it went to a board. I'd contacted them and they said it's just a process you've got to go through. Now, I come to find out 2 weeks later that this is just a tick box exercise, and dependent on your conviction. And I had a drug conviction, unfortunately. Oh, there you go. Fantastic. Jamie's got it up. So because of my conviction, it had ticked a box that just does another standard check. But as the person that received this letter, it turned my world upside down. I thought, everything I'd worked so hard for was going to be gone. Why they're planning to bar me? It didn't kind of make sense, because I already worked in support and I was a student. I'd assumed I'd already been risk assessed. Following that, I don't know if Jamie can get up the other letter. I think within 2 weeks, I received another letter to state that it's fine, and not to worry. We decided not to bar you. But now, in hindsight, going through this, I'm able to kind of offer support to people to let them know you may receive this letter. It's not the end of the world, but it can be a tick box exercise, and it depends on your conviction. It might not apply to you. However, when you apply for DBS, I wasn't told this. I wasn't informed of any of this that kind of occurred. So as you can imagine, now being able to tell people in hindsight, they can expect this. And if it does come, they can kind of present it to us and we're able to support them through it. I think the DBS proceed as in, this webinar is about positive disclosing your offences. And for some people, positively talking about an offence that you're massively ashamed of is very, very difficult. However, it's a conversation that you are going to have with an employer if they require a DBS. So we kind of always tell people, just be open and honest. I always found that it's better to kind of have this conversation during the interview process rather than have a fantastic interview, everything's gone well, then they've asked you for a DBS, and then the information is in front of them and they're wondering, why did you not, we've had a 2-hour talk and it's been fantastic. Why did this individual not discuss this with us then? And most people assume it's because it's anxiety and that they might be ashamed of it, but some people assume kind of a different spectrum, and then you're withholding it from them. And I've had so many people that have had really good interviews, and then when it's come to that process, they've not been offered a position, and we can only kind of put it down to purely because they've not spoke about it. And if you are having a good interview, sometimes it can be it's a lot easier, because you can say, look, this is going really well. I really want to tell you something that I know is going to come up. I want to be open and honest with you before we go any further. And most employers that we found really appreciate honesty, and it goes a long, long, long way in kind of gaining and securing employment. That's my little bit about in regards to my DVS process and the effects. Please don't hesitate to ask any questions at the end in regards to my kind of DBS journey, you might say, or the process and the letters that you may receive or won't receive.
Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about the appeals process as well, how you appealed that decision?
Sorry, I didn't actually appeal there is an appeals process. I didn't actually appeal the decision because I wasn't placed on the barring list. However, I did find out about there are several people. I found out through Unlock that you can be placed on the barring list, and you can present a case to the DBS to say, well, I shouldn't be put on this barring list. It involves a lot of work, a lot of supporting documentation from just kind of detailing your change and your rehabilitation. So if you can get letters from probation to support you, if you can get letters from an employer to say, we know he's done this, but his offences were committed many years ago, and since his offences he's undertook this course in changing behaviour, he's volunteered at this place. So because I didn't have to appeal, but I still found out all the kind of roads to appeal if I was placed on this list. But there is an appeals process, and it is fairly fair from what I know of. I know a few individuals that have appealed and then once they were placed on the list and then removed from the list. But it is a case of kind of gathering all the supporting evidence you can possibly gather and all the references you can get, personal references in regards to kind of your change and your journey and what you've been through and now what you're doing. And as I said, your DBS is always going to be in the past. It's never going to be present. And when you tell people that, it does hit them to say it's never going to be a current offence. It's always going to be something you've done previously. And obviously, the fact you're applying for a DBS for an employment shows your change. It shows that you're no longer in the criminal world and you've completely changed, kind of your outset and your mindset.
Brilliant, thanks Chris, that's really good of you, and some really nice comments in there. So yeah, thank you Susan, thank you Tanya as well for your comments there. That's really good, and thanks again Chris. I really appreciate you sharing your voice of experience there. It's really important.
No problem.
Okay, back to the slides. See, Chris has got all the good stuff, I've just got PowerPoint, but let's see how we get on here. Okay, there we are. So yeah, myself and Chris, when we were talking about this, Chris really wanted to share his experience, because what Chris brings to a lot of the work that he does with us is his own experience, and he's faced, as Chris would testify with me, he's faced a lot of challenges all the way across, and every time he's faced with with a brick wall, he's really good in terms of smashing it straight down and just walking straight through. So Chris is great because not only is he sort of talk the talk, but he walks the walk as well. So thank you, Chris, for sharing your experience there.
No problem.
So in terms of disclosing convictions, when it comes to the recruitment process, essentially, although every recruitment process is different, it comes down to there's generally two types of applications that you're going to face. If you're going for work with a larger organisation, their recruitment process is pretty much standardised. So whether you're going for a job at the sort of the bottom of the rung, it's pretty much similar to if you're at the top of the rung of the ladder. It's fairly standardised. But essentially, there are two kinds of applications. One is that you know that they're going to do checks. So there's a tick box exercise there. So the first one is we do checks. So a formal check is going to be carried out. So they should ask you to disclose before the interview. However, if not, you should disclose before the formal disclosure is carried out, the DBS check. Why is that important? Well, if you know that something's going to come on that check, it's probably better to let them know, so it's not a surprise to them. The other one is the tick box and waiting till interview, which you often see. And what people do here, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on with some of the clips that we've got, if it's a tick box and wait until the interview, there's a natural assumption there that people decide to tick no and think, I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll tick no because then I'll get an interview, and then at the interview I'll tell people then that I've got a conviction. It's a totally understandable human reaction. However, prior to the coronavirus pandemic, recruitment was pretty competitive. My God, it's going to be competitive now, you know, people going for work. You don't want to give any potential employer any sniff of a reason why they shouldn't employ you. Now, a lot of companies are looking for, if you're shortlisting for a particular role, you're looking for any reason that you can to get that literal stack of applications. And I've been on the other end of job applications where I'm interviewing, and on Friday HR turn up with 70 odd applications, and you're expected to shortlist over the weekend and get it down to 10 or so, like that. You're looking for any reason to get that number down. Okay, so if you've got somebody who said that they haven't got a conviction, and then when it comes to the interview they say, by the way, I know that I ticked that I didn't have a conviction, however I do have a conviction, and you may well present it really, really well. However, what you have done to that potential employer is you have given them a cast iron, stone cold reason why they shouldn't employ you, because you have just perfectly shown a level of dishonesty to that organisation. So you have said that you don't have a conviction, and there at the interview you're saying you do have a conviction. So they'll use that as a reason why not to employ you. Okay? So if you ever come across that thing where there's a tick box and then we're going to wait until the interview, please tick that you do have a conviction. I'm going to come on how you can disclose effectively if you're faced with that process, but don't tick no and then explain later on. You won't get the job. They'll just use that as a reason why not to employ you, and it puts you back. Generally, what people say is disclose at the earliest possible stage. That way you won't feel you're hiding something. If you're asked, disclose that you've got an unspent conviction, okay? Or that if it's a role that requires a standard or enhanced check, that you've got a previous conviction that is now spent. I'm going to come on to this, how you can disclose here, but I think it's important to put a little bit of a structure to it. So I'm going to give you 3 things that we can look at here. So the first one I call WADL. So I love a good acronym. Me, I'm all for that. I've got a terrible memory, so if I can stick an acronym to it, it always helps me to remember. So try and put a bit of a structure to how you're going to disclose. Think to yourself here. How you're going to do that, and by putting a bit of a structure to it, it takes the personal out of it as much as you can. Of course, it's a personal experience, and we're never going to be able to totally remove it, but it helps to sort of externalize it and think of it in a slightly more business way rather than it being personal. So first of all, the WADL, I say what, it's the what. So what was happening in the time of your life and the circumstances, okay? Were you in with a bad crowd? Did you, grow up without any sort of positive role models around you? Were you in and out of trouble with the law? Maybe you had a drugs conviction. Maybe you had a sort of a drug addiction, and you were sort of stealing to fund that. Did you have, really sort of the disruptive influences going on in your life at the time? Okay. Secondly, the A for WADL, it's about being accountable. So acknowledging that, yeah, I made a bad mistake then. The then is very important. Okay, so it's about being accountable for your actions, and acknowledging that, yeah, okay, I made a mistake then. Then it's the D, which is about your own personal development. It's about saying, okay, that happened then, but look what I have done since. Look at my education. Look at where I volunteered. Look at maybe some of the employment that I've done. I just realised it says exployment. That's obviously supposed to say employment. I've read through this a dozen times and I've never noticed that before. So it's about the employment that you've got. The question I think from Chloe before in the chat was about, what about putting employment down that you've done in prison? I think it's a really valid one. There are employment opportunities that you can do in prison that don't say HMP Cardiff or HMP Prescott or HMP Park or wherever in there. It might be that you are, a volunteer, peer mentor with St Giles. It might be that you're a listener with the Samaritans. It could be all those kind of things. Up in HMP Kirkham, up in the northwest where I'm from, they've got Recycling Lives. You can write it down so that it might not say HMP and then the prison after it if you have the opportunity. However, by putting it down in the best way, what it does show is that you have work experience, so that you didn't just sit in your cell for 23 hours a day, you know, playing a bit of ping pong and watching Cash in the Attic. You've actually engaged with the system, and by putting your disclosure down in a structure, by merely mentioning the fact that you have a custodial conviction in your past, you're putting it into context. You're showing that that was then, this is what I've done since, and this is why you can see that I've engaged with the sort of the rehabilitative programs on offer at the time. Finally, the L for waddle. What have you learned from the experience? Now, that learned can be professional, but it can be personal. It can be, you know, I've missed the birth of my child whilst I've been inside. I've had a lot of time for personal reflection. I've learned that I made some really poor life choices, and I don't want that going forward. I've grown up. I've matured since I've been in prison. All those sort of things. So it's about, you know, what was happening in your life at the time. So acknowledge that, you know, place it into a point of time in your life in the past, about being accountable for your actions. Okay, I shouldn't have done that. I know that, but you know, this is how I've developed from that, and this whole process has shown me that I've learned a great deal from that experience. You know, I've matured as an individual. I can use those life experiences. So that's what I say about that whole sort of like waddle process. Then it's about showing how you have changed, because an employer, like I said in some of the previous webinars, an employer doesn't want to employ the person who 5 or 6 years ago was running with the boys, was stealing toward, was getting into all kinds of stuff, that was jumping out of a first floor window, you know, on a dawn raid by the police and getting cuffed in. They don't want to employ that person. But you can't change that. That's happened. You can't change the past. But what you can do is you can start to inform your own personal narrative. You can talk about those personal development courses you can do. You can talk about the education that you've done since, the experience you've got, whether it's a volunteer work or it's paid work, stage 1 or stage 2. You've got that experience as well. What you've learned from the experience, you know, you've reconnected with your family. You know, you've now got a stable life. You've got stable housing, all those kind of things. So it's about showing that you have changed. The best part of change does require a level of honesty, and self-reflection, and it does take you out of your comfort zone. It isn't easy. I know that. I know a couple of people who've been through it. I know a couple of people who've only done a little bit of it. And you know, one of our volunteers who's been on our program is Anton. He's a fantastic example of this, as obviously is Chris, and plenty of the people that we work with on there. But if you go through that process of change, you can start to leave those feelings in your past, and you can begin that process of change, and it's clear to show to a potential employer. So I've taken this as 5 R's, and there's a little book. There's all kinds of resources out there, and I quite like this book, How to Get a Great Job with a Criminal Record. So there's tons of resources on there. So this is Phil Martin's book. Tons of stuff in there. It's not cheap, so if you work for an organisation, get them to get you a copy if you can. But there's a really good section there about accepting change. And what you can do there is you can look at things like the remorse, or being sorry for your crime and showing regret, trying to show that as much as you can. Oh, sorry about that, I've just gone back. You can look at the reasons, so looking at those background circumstances and maybe some of those personal triggers. So the fact that, you know, you were you had a poor choice of friends, you didn't have any positive role models around you. Those personal triggers, it may be that you had an addiction, you were, you know, and that was the trigger for your offending behaviour. Then it's about taking responsibility. So you're not passing the buck. Okay, you're saying, okay, I understand that, and that I've also caused harm to individuals as well. And then it's about the rehabilitation. So what have you learned from the experience? How you're not going to make the same mistake again. And then finally, it's about that reconciliation. So often that can be things like, you know, those sort of like family connections that you've rebuilt, you know, making up for the past, and that you're determined to contribute in a positive way. We meet so many people, Chris and I, through our work, who talk about wanting to give back, look, I know the experience that I went through, and if I can just work in that area, if I can just make one person, if I can work with just one young person and stop them making the same mistakes that I did, then I know that I've made a positive contribution, and I'll be happy. So they're the 5 R's that Phil talks about in his book: remorse, reasons, responsibility, rehabilitation, and reconciliation. So I've talked about waddle, and I've talked about the 5 R's. Well, what do you do with all this information? I'd argue that you create a self-disclosure statement. Okay. Now, just like when you're doing a CV, there's some golden rules that you should try and stick to. So we all know the ones for your CV. You know, don't give yourself a crazy email address. You know, northernerforever@hotmail.com. You know, give yourself a standardised email address. You know, those sort of things that we do. No Comic Sans. Same thing for self-disclosure statements. Keep it short, one side of A4. Otherwise, you're going to go on and on and on and on and on. You want to keep it short and punchy. Personalise it to the role that you're applying for. So if you're sending it into us, you know, address your statement at the top. Dear Mr. Leslie, dear Mr. Grundy, self-employment mentor for Inside Out Support Wales. So that the person who's reading this know that it hasn't been something that you've run off, you know, 24 photocopies, you know, in a library on a Friday afternoon when you were in a rush to get to the pub. They know that you've taken the time to actually create that, and it means a little bit more. Keep it very simple. Keep it easy to understand. Don't use any jargon. Don't use about, you know, any phrases that you might have used on the inside. Don't talk about rottle, bird. Just keep it very boring, very simple, very business-like. Get support. Get support from probation workers, youth workers, employment advisors, family members. There's a bunch of different reasons why I suggest that you get support from them. One, you may have forgotten some of the things that have happened to you that have been positive. So that's particularly important to talk about there. You might, when they read it, they may say, well, hold on, you didn't mention that you did this. That's a hell of an achievement. Because they'll look at it with an external perspective, an external viewpoint, which is particularly important. You can get support for your typing as well. So I've met a number of individuals who've come through the criminal justice system who have additional learning needs, things like dyslexia. So it might read great to you, but just get them to double check it over, making sure that your grammar's right, you know, making sure that you're not, you haven't got any typos like in my previous slide. That's particularly important. You need to send it to the right person. You need to mark it confidential. If you don't know who the right person is, in terms of when you're applying for work, ring up that organisation and say, hi, my name's Jamie, I'm applying for the post of support worker. I've got some additional information which is confidential that I need to send through to the right person. Could you give me the name and contact details of the person that should be sent through to? And they'll say, yeah, okay, it's Chris Leslie, and here's our address. So you need to make sure that it goes through to that right person. The reason why that is important, even though you might be thinking, well, I'm open about my conviction, if it goes through to the right person, hopefully, touch wood, that person has had training in terms of how to deal with self-disclosure statements and convictions properly. So if it goes to the right person, it should be being treated with the importance that it deserves. Finally, offer to meet and discuss any concerns. There will be questions, so don't be afraid of saying that in the final sentence. Okay? Now, that's how you should do a self-disclosure statement. I'm going to tell you the what in a minute. Now, I'm going to put a caveat on this. I'm very professional. I don't swear, but I'm going to be swearing on this next slide. So if you're easily offended on a Friday morning, I apologise. Please cover your ears. But I suggest that the structure that is the best way to write a self-disclosure statement is the shit sandwich. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I didn't tell Chris I was going to be swearing this morning because he might have told me off.
He definitely did it.
So the reason why we talk about it being the shit sandwich is that shit sandwich has got the sort of, you know, the good stuff, which is the bread, the top and the bottom, and then you've got the shit in the middle. Okay, but it sounds very flippant. But I don't want it to be, because actually I think it's got a real lot of resonance there. Okay, and what that is, oh, sorry. Oh, see, easy. Let's get, oh gosh, here's me. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so if you use a shit sandwich structure, your first section of that particular statement should be talking about you, how you're really well suited for that particular role. Then in the middle, no more than 1 or 2 paragraphs tops, talk about what happened to you, the conviction. Keep it short, keep it factual, and explain the context. So don't go on about, well, it shouldn't have been me and I shouldn't have done this and he did that and she did this. Just keep to the facts. Talk about you received a conviction for and this was your sentence. But explain the context. However, and at the time I was, I didn't have any positive role models around me. I was in with a bad crowd. I didn't know any difference. I was living in a particularly chaotic lifestyle at the time. All those sort of things that can inform what happened to you. That's the context. Finally, talk about how you've changed from that point. Explain how your life is different now. If you can write that down, then that is going to make that person know that, okay, I'm reading this, but that's what happened to them then. This isn't the same person now that I'm seeing in front of me. Talk about how you have got a stable family life now, how your housing is much better, that you're off drugs, that you no longer work, you no longer live in that particular area. Talk about how you've done a great deal since then, and that's particularly important. It's all that's the L from the waddle. The reason I suggest that shit sandwich structure is simple. It ensures that the first and last impressions that potential employer has about you are positive. So if they remember the first thing or if they remember the last thing, you know that it's going to be positive. So that's why it's important. Okay. Finally, before we go over to a bit of Q&A, when you're in the interview, you're going to have people who are going to be a little bit apprehensive. So you need to think about positive interview skills. So I'm going to show you a little clip now of, it's a generic interview skills thing, but actually it could be written about someone coming, from a prison background looking for employment. So I'm going to share with you this little film, and then we'll have a bit of a Q&A at the end, if that's all right.
You've got the call and you've been invited for the job interview. My name's Becca and I'm a resourcer here at the One Group, and today we're going to be preparing you for interview do's and don'ts to help take away the stress. Preparation is key. Take time to read through your CV, the company and job specification to relate your answers back to the company needs. Relax, but don't be so relaxed you ignore the fact that you have an interview tomorrow. Showing up late to an interview tells the interviewer you're unorganised and could ruin your chances of landing the job. Hi Sam, I didn't think you were going to show up today.
Oh yeah, no, sorry, I was okay.
Remember, your interviewer is a person. They understand life happens, and so if you truly know you'll be running late, call and apologise. Keep the tone positive. First impressions count. Be confident, smile, shake your interviewer's hand and dress appropriately. Don't do a Sam wearing clothes that are way too casual, showing you don't care about the job, company or interviewer.
Thanks for me today. 20 minutes late for the interview. I didn't actually think you were going to turn up. What was the reason? Or bad traffic or anything like that?
Oh yeah, no, sorry, I was getting a sandwich along the way.
Okay. So Sam, it says here, your last company, you left after only a month. Did something happen?
Oh no, actually that was, so basically I was just too good for that company. I just kept coming up with these awesome ideas and they just couldn't handle it, they couldn't see, because I'm like really
You don't
smart.
get extra credit for making things up. Be honest and use your prepared answers to showcase yourself in a positive way.
So Sam, the salary is fairly market rate for a role like this. The holidays, they go up after time, but you will start on just the basic 20 days. Plus 8 days.
Remember, an interview is a two-way process. As much as an interviewer is looking to see if you're a good fit for them, you should be looking to see if the company is a good fit for you.
So Rebecca, the salary as discussed, it's fairly market rate for this position.
Okay, does that go up through training and development?
Yep, it does actually,
Okay.
which is good.
Listen to the interviewer and always ask questions.
So Rebecca, what made you apply for the position?
Well, after coming across the role and researching the company a bit, I really liked how it all looked. Remember, you didn't do all that preparation for the sake of it. Show enthusiasm and highlight to the interviewer everything you've learned about the company. Even if you were late, it's always important to leave a lasting positive impression of yourself.
We'll call you in a couple of days.
Alright, cheers. I'll look out for your email.
Yep, thanks. Okay, thanks Rebecca for coming in today. Yeah, it's a pleasure to meet yourself.
Yeah, thank you for taking your time out of the day, and hopefully I'll hear from you soon.
Perfect. I'll call you probably by the end of the week.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. See you
Thanks.
later.
Bye.
There we go. I love that video. It's a straightforward kind of like interview tips video, but it could be written about some of the guys I've met before, you know, who are like looking for employment. I remember being in HMP Cardiff, introducing a person who was interested at going to university in a year or two's time. That person being introduced to an admissions officer who could really help their application, and they just sauntered up just like Sam did then, hoodie on, hands down the pants. I was like, oh my god, this is terrible. And I took him to the side and said, look, don't talk to them like that, you know. So I really like that sort of that kind of example. I think it's a straightforward sort of interview tips video, but the reason I put that interview in there, that interview tips video in there, is because if you think about it, the disclosure statement and the process of disclosure should be just another part of the job interview, the job application process. It shouldn't be the be all and end all. So it's important, if you've got anybody who has got to disclose when they're going for work, that they are not focusing just on the disclosure and not thinking about everything else. Doing a recce to where your interview is the day before, so you know how to get there, checking out the bus routes, getting there 10-15 minutes early, you know, the eye contact and firm handshakes when we're allowed to do that. Maybe it's an elbow bump still. It's all those sort of things, about saying thank you, about being professional. It's about all of those things. Oh, so let's get this out. A sec, sorry. Okay, so have we got any questions? I'll just sort of stop sharing my screen now. So if you've got any questions from there, be happy to take those questions if there is anything. I saw a couple of things coming through in the chat then. So let's see if we've got any questions. I think with the disclosure side of things, like I say, I try to just sort of like frame it in terms of being another part of the job application process. But I know that for some individuals, it will be particularly sort of anxiety inducing, because it's that sort of thing that, you know, are they going to give me a fair crack of it, or are we not? So when would the disclosure statement go in with the application? I think you'd have to look at the individual application itself, Richard. Quite often there's an application form that states, you know, asks you to disclose if you've got an application. If you've got a previous unspent conviction. I wouldn't put it in necessarily with the application. What I would do is I would make certain that you do tick that you have a previous conviction, a previous unspent conviction, and then I would focus on making the rest of the application form as, you know, as good as you can. And then, I think then the disclosure statement will be sent in once that applicant has been invited for interview. That's the best way to do it. Also, another point on the disclosure statement. In some places, they might ask you just to talk about it. In other places, they might ask for you to send something in. I think I think what you can do when you're faced with that sort of situation, that if you have already written it down and you've got that disclosure statement down really, really fully, then what you have is you've got a process whereby you know the information that is on the page, because it's in there, because it's your own experience and you've written it down in a personal and professional way. So I think you've got an opportunity then to talk about it in a really effective way. Even if it's written down or even if it's verbally, you've still got it there. So we've got somebody with their hand up who wants to ask a question. So who have we got there? So who have we got that wants to ask a question? We have got I can't see who it is, but if you got, yeah, if you want to ask a question, you got your hand up. Yeah, the floor is yours. If you pop your mic on, you can ask a question away. Oh, maybe we just popped it in the chat. Okay. Okay. Well, Alex has put a question in the chat. Let's have a look. Have you ever encountered a situation where a company has stated that they will consider applicants with unspent convictions, only to be told after being interviewed that they were unsuccessful due to having previous convictions? I've not come across that personally. However, you do hear anecdotal information out there. A common one is if an organisation doesn't treat the disclosure process with the sort of gravity that it deserves. I've heard it said anecdotally before by other sort of professionals in our field that if anything comes back on a disclosure on a DBS check, for example, if someone needs an enhanced check, then that they will flat out refuse that person even if the convictions are spent. That generally is a failure by the company to understand the disclosure process. Either that individual hasn't been trained by the DBS service, or they don't really know how to treat disclosure properly. So that's something that I've heard anecdotally. I've done a bit of training before with Unlock, and that's something that some of the fellow professionals that were in that training course talked about there. Okay, and it's interesting what you said, that you've encountered that with a well-known company. It was devastating for the individual concerned. Yeah, it's a real challenge. What personally I will be doing, if you're an individual with a conviction and you're out of work, generally you're going to be firing applications off all over the place. You're just desperate to get that one role, because once you've got your first job, then great, you can breathe a little bit easier, you can sleep a little bit easier at night and what have you. But if you're able to be a bit more strategic with your job search criteria, that often helps. So every company these days has got a website, we've got annual reports. Have a look at that company, try and engage as much as you possibly can to work out whether that company is as good a fit for you as you are as good a fit for that company. So look on their website. Are they talking about things like social justice? Look them up on Business in the Community's Ban the Box website. Are they a company that removes the tick box for roles where it's not necessarily appropriate to be asking if people have got a conviction, because it's not necessary for the role that they're advertising for? If they are a member of the Business in the Community Ban the Box campaign, you're probably going to get a fair crack of the whip. So I think it's all about working out whether you're a good fit for that company, but more importantly, it's about working out whether that company is a good fit for you. Okay, now I've been in jobs before where after 6 months I've thought, why did I take this job? This company's not in line with my own personal values. So it's about being a little bit strategic if you're able to. Chris, I don't know if you've got anything to say on that side of things as well.
I haven't experienced companies that have kind of had that stance. I've experienced training providers where I've rang them up to send individuals on a course, and they've agreed to it, and that's all been fine. And then the moment they've asked me about our company, they've kind of done a 360 and not unfortunately not let me book a place on the course for the individuals. Now, it was really upsetting to think that, and it was a street works course I was providing, and this was direct employment for the people that were going to be part of this course. However, it was just a case of us having to kind of find it, and we ended up finding a really nice gentleman who could run the course, and he came and run the course for us in our own offices. I've had a lot of friends that have kind of gone for jobs and had really good interviews, and then turn around and says, and then when I've asked them how's it gone, I said, yeah, I think I've got it. And then after the DBS has come back, it's kind of a no, and there's all sorts of kind of excuses as into why. A lot of the times the employer won't provide an excuse. They'll just be like, your application was not successful at this point. I just always tell people just to not stop, don't give up. It's a case of you might apply for 10 or 20 even, and one of those employers will be really sympathetic and will be understanding that, you know, you've had a life experience before. But I can say off personal experience, I worked my way up to be a project worker in the Pobble group, and I didn't think it was possible before doing it. I didn't think of it, and since me, that I've had several friends go to work in companies and work their way up to management positions, really senior management positions, in fact. So it's unfortunately a case of trial and error, and just keep on persistent at it. You will find there are sympathetic Virgin's a really good employer who've got a really good corporate social responsibility. I'm trying to think of other large employers, but there are also smaller employers who haven't got such large companies, who, you know, might have had personal family member experience, you know, have gone to prison, and understand that people do make mistakes, and they are prepared to give in. There's a lot in Wales. I can't name them to hand, but there are quite a few in Wales that will give people a chance. But I see one of the questions said, when do you suggest a supporting letter going? In regards, I think there's for and against in this. You can send it beforehand, and someone could read it and completely turn off and be like, oh, this person's got a conviction, I just don't want to entertain it. Or you can send it, you can kind of take it with you to your interview, because I've found some people, it's hard to relive with what you've done, depending on your crime. It's hard to kind of discuss it and talk about it. But if you can go to an interview and say, after the interview's done, look, just to let you know before I leave, I have got a criminal conviction, and I'd like to give you this letter, and it kind of explains what, why, how, exactly what kind of Jamie said. That could leave a real lasting effect on an employer, for them to turn around and say, whoa, you know, he's took the time out to write this letter, or she has took the time out to write this letter, give it to us. It's a personal letter, do you know what I mean? It's containing things that are very personal in nature. But in terms of companies, that I've not experienced it myself, but it's definitely prevalent through employment, especially with offences. You've just got to keep knocking away at the door.
Cheers, Chris. Yeah, definitely. And what I've done is I put a little link into the chat of the Ban the Box campaign from Business in the Community. If you've not come across Business in the Community before, they're like a membership charity for companies that help them meet their corporate social responsibility targets. Ban the Box is sort of an inclusive campaign that they have in terms of their fair recruitment processes. So there's loads of stuff in there. So if you have a look at Ban the Box, you'll find tons of employers there as well. Also, I'm going to put a couple of other things in the chat for you. I'm going to put two things. One is a link to a load of disclosure statements from Unlock. So there's some really good examples of self-disclosure statements on there. Loads and loads and loads. What I would say is, if you've got an individual and they need help doing a self-disclosure statement, take one of those, use it as a template for your own experience. Also, there's a really good film. I'm not going to show it now because it's 15 minutes. A really fantastic film that I discovered. Again, it's from Unlock, and a company who are no longer in existence, unfortunately, anymore. I can tell, Red Kite Video. But it's a really good clip because it talks about a person. It's basically the story of a man applying for work, and all those sort of line in the sand, moral dilemma points that person is going through. So should they disclose for an application? Should they not disclose? What happens if they disclose and go through the application process? What if they don't disclose and go through the application process? And there's a few other sort of points, and it's a really interesting film. So well worth 15 minutes of your time watching that. After this, obviously, don't everybody leave me now, otherwise me and Chris will get a bit self-conscious. But I think that'll be particularly useful for you on there. Just going back as well to what you said, Alex, in your comment, and it's something that I often think about. It's about, you know, I always try and find the negatives from the positives. Sorry, let's turn that around. I try and find the positives from the negatives, and that goes back to sort of like, you know, having a growth mindset. So what you have is you have a process whereby people who are looking for work, they're just looking for that one chance. That's all they're looking for, that one opportunity. Now, when you get knockbacks, it's really easy to be, you know, to have your confidence dented. And yeah, it is, most definitely. But if you're able to look at the longer term, if you apply for work, and you put in a disclosure statement and you think you should be given a fair crack of the whip, and you're fairly convinced that you haven't been given a fair crack of the whip, you've got two ways you can deal with that. If you're able to evidence that you aren't given a fair crack of the whip, refer them to the DBS service themselves, who will investigate, most definitely. But also, if you aren't able to evidence the fact that you weren't given a fair crack of the whip, but you think that you should have been, think about it in the bigger picture. Do you want to work for that organisation? Okay, yeah, you might get a pay slip for 3 or 4 months, but is that the sort of organisation that you want? If they're like that at the top, that's going to filter down to the people that you're working with. How are they going to treat you? They're not going to treat you fairly. Is that the sort of organisation that you want to work for? Chris talks about some of the experiences that we've had. One of my first experiences of supporting someone straight out of prison, several years ago now, they had their heart set on going to a particular university. I won't say which one. We made the application process. We followed it to a T. We followed the application process, and we met with individuals in that university, and we had a really positive experience there. And they asked that person to go away and to do some additional learning, ready to come back to university the following year. And we thought that was a fair request because they needed to get some additional skills. When we came back to that university 12 months later, they said no, they didn't want to admit that person. So it was a very slow burn no, and it was a very sly no. As it happened, I got that person into Cardiff Met straight away, and it wasn't Chris, in case you're thinking, it was someone else. And that person flourished, and they now are able to look back on that particular journey in a very positive way, and they're still in contact with me. They still drop me a message every so often. They're now in full-time employment, they've got a stable family life. At that point in their life, they're able to leave it behind. And they said to me at the time, I'm glad I didn't go to that university because my life would have been a lot different now. So I'm going to leave it there with that point. I don't know if you've got anything else to add, Chris, or maybe we should just wrap it up from there, because so people can go away and get a slice of toast mid-morning, get a tide us over to lunchtime. So I hope you've all enjoyed the Voices of Experience series, and thank you very much for today. Chris, anything else to add?
Is it unmuted?
No, you're fine, you're good.
Okay, no, I just want to thank everybody for coming. Thanks for kind of listening to our kind of experiences within the criminal justice sector and how we kind of navigate around certain pitfalls. Please feel free we'll drop our emails in the chat. Just drop us an email if you'd like any more kind of information on what we do and how we do it.
Yeah, most definitely. I'm just furiously typing mine in now. If you want to type yours in, Chris, as well.
Yep.
There we go. So just drop us an email if you want. You're probably fed up of having emails from me all week. You've been having loads of them. So if you haven't got my email by now, I may take it personally, but I'm sure it'll be fine. But thanks again, everybody. It's been our last Voices of Experience webinar this week. If you've liked what we've done, there's going to be an evaluation form coming out this afternoon, and there's going to be a little Easter egg for you in that evaluation form, in that one of you out there will be able to win a prize. I'm going to keep my powder dry. I'm not going to say anything more than that, but thank you very much, everybody. Look forward to meeting you online in future events. There's plenty of people out there that we work with on a weekly basis, so we'll look forward to catching you again. And I just hope that some of the things that we've talked about, not only in this Voices of Experience webinar, but in all the Voices of Experience webinars, will be able to positively impact not only your work, maybe your personal life, and maybe your family members, and maybe your professional life in a positive way as much as we possibly can. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll look forward to seeing you online very soon. Take care. Bye now.
Take care. Bye-bye.